Icepick Surgeon, the book right here, written by Sam Kean. I am JD Smith, the general manager of Poets and Prose Coffee House of their flagship store. We at Poets and Prose are excited to offer these events virtually as well in the middle of all this craziness. We thank you for coming to them. They are amazing. We love having them. So since we are virtual, I want to remind people that you can pick up these books through the links in chat. Particularly the book we're talking about, Icepick Surgeon. I have been reading it, been loving it, really enjoying every portion of it. I cannot recommend it enough. Additionally, we'll be doing Q&As during this. You can ask the Q&As in the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get everyone's questions, but we are limited time for about an hour. So if we're not able to get to everyone's questions, we apologize in advance, but we're doing everything we can to get to them all. I'd like to introduce our two panelists. We have Sam Kean, who is our author. Sam, his new book, Icepick Surgeon, as I keep saying. And the title fully is Icepick Surgeon, Murder, Fraud, Sabotage, Piracy, and Other Dastardly Deeds Perpetrated in the Name of Science. And as the name suggests, it is a book of many tales of when science has gone way too far, and it's very interesting. Sam is an accomplished writer. He has written for many publications, including Mental Flaws, Psychology Today, and The New Scientist. He was also published in many narrative style books, such as The Icepick Surgeon. The books include The Bastard Brigade, The Tales of the Dueling Neurosurgeons, and The Despairing Spoon, which coincidentally has the same name as Sam's podcast. Also fantastic if you have not checked it out. In conversation tonight is Dr. Lindsey Fitzharris, a best-selling author and a medical historian. Her first book, The Butchering Art, is about the life of Joseph Lister, also a fantastic read, recommendation of mine as well. It won the Penn Award in Literary Science. Lindsey has also authored for publications as well as Wall Street Journal, Scientific American, and The Guardian. She's the host also of the Curious Life and Death of, which explores some of the most mysterious deaths in history. And without further ado, I will hand off the talk.
All right, I am so excited to be here tonight. By the way, guys, if you see me looking to the right, it's because I'm monitoring your questions, so do send them through and I'll filter them in while I'm interviewing Sam. Sam, I'm so excited to be interviewing you. I am a huge fan of your books. I have read everything you've written from front to back. And I have to say, having now read The Icepick Surgeon, I think it's probably one of my favorite books that you've ever written.
Thank you.
Now, if you're coming to this event and you're not familiar with Sam's books, firstly, what are you doing? You need to get out there and read some of his stuff because it's absolutely excellent. I want to share 3 weird things that I learned while reading The Icepick Surgeon with you, just to give you a flavor of what's to come. So number 1, alligators don't have lips and they can't chew. And if you want to know how that is relevant to a book called The Icepick Surgeon, you're going to have to read it. Flamingo tongue is a delicacy fit for a prince's table. So this book has something for everybody. And my absolute favorite, which is 17th century pirates, had a form of health insurance. And also, by the way, that reminds me that you guys really need to read the footnotes of this book because they're just as fascinating as the book itself. Now, if I'm leading anybody to believe that this book is just a random collection of facts, I would be doing it injustice, because Sam, you really bring up so many thought-provoking questions about science and how we view it through this lens. So let's start with a broad question. How did you become interested in the darker side of science?
I've always been interested in sort of the human side of science, talking about the good things and the bad things, about the heroes and the villains, the joys and the sorrows, all sorts of different aspects of science. And I'd been collecting string, I guess, for a few years, talking to people and hearing stories about scientists who committed crimes, who'd done dastardly things. And what really got me interested in these tales in the book was that these were scientists who hadn't just done bad things. They were scientists who'd done bad things in the name of science, in that they had been pursuing knowledge in some ways. And usually we think about that as a good thing. It's a good thing when people pursue knowledge. It's what gets scientists up early in the morning, keeps them at the lab late at night, pushes them. They do that extra experiment, whatever it is. But in this case, they got so obsessed with some topic or idea that they took it too far. They trampled ethical boundaries and they committed crimes in the name of science. So the way they had taken that good thing and twisted it into something kind of evil was really fascinating for me. I've always enjoyed true crime, and this was kind of a true crime version of science. So that's what I was trying to do.
And, you know, you do it really well, because obviously, you know, as a historian, I'm always wary about judging the past, but using the standards today. But these are people who were actually doing things that were recognizably bad in their own day. We can look at that through their own kind of ethical lens as well in a lot of ways. Now, I love to get to the gritty details. So I want to get to the first story, which the book is named after, which is Walter Freeman, the lobotomist in the 20th century. This is such a crazy story because it didn't happen that long ago. So can you just tell people sort of out there generally who he is, what he did, when he was doing it?
Yeah, Walter Freeman was a neurologist, a doctor in the United States, actually was working mostly in Washington, D.C., where I live right now. And he became associated with the lobotomy, a specific kind of lobotomy called a transorbital lobotomy. And the thing that I didn't know when I was starting to research and write the book was that Walter Freeman, his work in a lot of ways was defensible at the beginning. And that sounds really crazy to people when they hear it nowadays, that lobotomies were at all defensible at the beginning, but in some ways they actually were. Because at the time he was working in the early 1930s, 1940s, they basically had no other treatments for mental illness. There were zero psychiatric drugs, no other treatments. For the worst cases, all they could do essentially was put people in an asylum. It was essentially a warehouse for human beings, lock them in a straitjacket, and that was it. They just had to sit there year after year after year. And so when Freeman and others came about and they invented this procedure, the lobotomy, in a last resort way, it was actually defensible because it calmed people down in some cases. So I talk about in the book, if Freeman had not been so ambitious and not tried to push things so far, he might have gone down as someone who did some good in history.
Right.
But unfortunately, Freeman was too ambitious and did try to take things too far. Someone once called him the Henry Ford of lobotomies, and that basically sums up the problem right there, in that he tried to make them an outpatient procedure. They were kind of a Jiffy Lube lobotomy, in that he actually took an ice pick that he found in his kitchen drawer. He opened it up one day, found this ice pick, and decided this was the tool he was going to use in the future on people's brains, to do brain surgery with an ice pick. And he tried to bring this surgery to the masses, and that he would go around from asylum to asylum, do as many as he could in one day. So in one day, his record was doing 25 lobotomies. He did them on children as young as 4 years old. And his most famous case was Rosemary Kennedy, who was the sister of John F. Kennedy, the president. So it's just unbelievable how many thousands of patients he did this surgery on, most of whom probably did not need it. So that story of someone who started off with good intentions and then took a really dark, terrible turn was really kind of fascinating to me. And those were the kind of stories I was trying to highlight in the book. That's why he ended up becoming the title character, the Icepick Surgeon.
Yeah, I mean, I posted about this on Instagram to advertise this event. And a lot of people, the Freeman story really resonates because it wasn't that long ago. And a lot of people are struggling with mental health right now. And they wonder, you know, could they have been one of those victims, you know, if they'd been born in a slightly earlier period. And it's such a strange concept too, because I think that the idea that it was like the Jiffy Lube, it was almost like the ice cream truck, you know, coming around to give these lobotomies. Was it true that he didn't use anesthesia, or was that a myth? I can't remember.
No, he did not use anesthesia. Sometime because he would not actually open the brain up in the later surgeries. He would, and I apologize in advance for anyone squeamish out there, but he would actually go through their eye socket right here with the ice pick. Sometimes, usually he did knock them out by giving them electroshocks. So he would knock them out with electroshocks.
Well.
Yeah.
There you go.
And then use the ice pick on them. And usually he could have it done in about 20 minutes or so. So 20-minute neurosurgery.
That is, I mean, I can't imagine going through the eye wouldn't be painful. The whole thing is just mind blowing. Yeah. And he is one of those sort of, you know, the thing of nightmares, really. And actually, you kind of answered one of my questions, because if you guys could forgive a trade question for a second, as an author, I'm always interested in how, you know, the process, but the Icepick Surgeon, I mean, Walter Freeman, guys, is one part of this book. And there are so many great stories that are included in this book. So what were there other contenders for the title? I'm just curious.
There were. I'm trying to think of what they were. I think I just kind of went through each story in the book. So, you know, the piracy story, the espionage story, the murder story, and just tried to find one thing within that chapter that might have fit. So yeah, I'm trying to think. The atomic spy. There was an atomic spy in there.
Yeah.
The Unabomber shows up. I think there was something related to the Unabomber at one point. So yeah, there were different titles we tried.
Are like, their minds are like, how does all this fit together? And that's why, I mean, this book is just brilliant, because it's just like a landscape of bad deeds in science. You know, kind of going in that direction. I want to talk about body snatchers, because I'm a medical historian. I love body snatchers. And for people out there who don't know who body snatchers are, they were these people who stole bodies and sold them to the anatomists in the 19th century. And they were kind of seen by the profession as a necessary evil. And I didn't really think too much about it until I read your book, and you told this very startling story that I just cannot shake from my head, which is that because of the types of bodies these body snatchers were stealing, which were largely people of lower class, because the cemeteries were rigged in certain ways that made it easier for these bodies to be stolen, there was a mistake that anatomists made about human anatomy, which translated into bad science and deaths later on. Can you explain this? Because this really, to me, is the core of your book, that unethical bad science also turns into, you know, actual bad practice as well.
Yeah, this was a very sad story, and now one I'd really not heard before. Again, I started writing the book. So basically, as you said, there were certain types of bodies that were being stolen and taken to medical schools. Usually poor people were the people who had their bodies stolen. And as we now know, looking back, being chronically poor, as crazy as it sounds, it can actually affect the shape of certain organs inside you. Mostly because people who are poor, they suffer from chronic stress for different reasons. They often, especially back then, they were in danger of losing their housing. They didn't know where their next meal was coming from. They often had to live outdoors. There was just chronic stress going on in their lives at all times. And because of that, some of their organs, some of their glands, I guess I should say, were pumping out stress hormones. And that can affect the size and shape of those glands. So in some cases, the glands, when they pump out too much hormone day after day after day, they shrink, they shrivel up. In other cases, they pump out too much hormone. It's like working a muscle. They get bigger. So when doctors were going in and they were looking at glands, especially in small children, they had a mistaken view of what those glands should look like, because they were only looking at the babies of poor people. So they weren't getting a representative sample, essentially, of what those glands should look like. So this ended up having a sort of awful effect when what we now would call SIDS, so sudden infant death syndrome, started to become a problem in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in that doctors wanted to know what was going on. So they started looking at middle class and rich babies who had died of this disease. And they looked at them, and there's a certain gland in the chest called the thymus gland in the chest. And they looked at the gland in these rich and upper class babies that had died of this disease, and it looked very large to them. They thought these babies had gigantic thymus glands, but they only thought that because they'd been looking at poor babies the entire time. And the poor babies who were dying of malnutrition, diarrhea, diseases, they had a shrunken thymus gland. So these doctors, because of that mistaken science, thought that these babies dying of SIDS had gigantic thymus glands. So they would go to other babies and they would say, oh my God, another gigantic thymus gland. We need to do something about this. Their theory was that the gigantic thymus gland was crushing their windpipes and suffocating them. So in the early 1900s, and this sounds awful, but what they decided to do is implement these measures to essentially take radiation, and they would shoot it at the chests of babies with what they thought were large thymus glands to try to shrink them down to what they thought was a healthy size for a thymus gland. And tens of thousands of children in the early 1900s underwent this procedure. There were tons of cancer cases, and even in the best case where they didn't get cancer, they suffered from hormone deficiencies, radiation burns, really awful consequences. So as you said, the sort of overall lesson I took from this was that this unethical scientific regime where they were kind of targeting and using poor babies ended up leading to bad science and harming other people in the process. So the unethical science led to bad science. And that's something you see a lot in the book, that when we compromise our morals for scientific progress, we usually end up with neither.
Yeah, I mean, this to me, again, that was absolutely fascinating because we tend to focus on body snatchers in the sort of obvious ways that it's bad. And of course, people in the past didn't want their relatives stolen, and there's all kinds of hysteria that breaks out around this kind of thing. Susie Lennox, I saw, just left a comment. She works on body snatching in the 19th century, and we are always talking about body snatching, but that was an incredible story and really illustrated, the point that you drive home in a lot of these stories in the book. Now, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, though, right? So not all of these people start out. In fact, the majority of them really didn't start out intending to do harm or to do anything, evil. So tell us about some of those people that really had very good intentions, started out, and then just went down this terrible path and ended up in your book, essentially.
Yeah. That was their punishment. Walter Freeman is one who comes to mind, the lobotomist, who again had good intentions at the start and just took things way too far. There was another one that also stands out, a man named John Cutler. He was a doctor who was working in the 1940s, and he got assigned the surprisingly pressing job of venereal disease in the military. World War II, they were really worried they were going to lose a lot of days to STDs, things like syphilis, gonorrhea. It was Cutler's job to figure out how to stop these diseases. So he had some ideas, tried some experiments, they didn't work. World War II ended, he really hadn't made much progress. So what he ends up doing is he ends up joining what's called the Public Health Service, the PHS, and he ends up meeting up with someone who ran some clinics in Guatemala. And this person running the clinics in Guatemala said, hey, why don't you come down to Guatemala and you can help us out here. You can bring equipment, personnel in, whatever, and then you can run the experiments you want to on syphilis and gonorrhea. And Cutler thought, oh, well, this is great. So they designed these experiments. And again, if you just look at it in kind of an abstract way, he was trying to do a good thing. He was trying to figure out how to stop these diseases. Unfortunately, the experiments that he designed were pretty awful in that basically prostitution was legal in Guatemala. So he was looking at health clinics to find women who had these diseases, who caught these diseases. And then he was going to find soldiers and prisoners, because prostitution was legal for prisoners as well. He was essentially going to bring the women to the men, let them have sex, and then try to expose the prisoners and soldiers to the STDs, but without telling them that he was going to expose them to these STDs. And he got away with these experiments completely. And in fact, he started doing even worse things where he would deliberately infect people with these STDs in the name, he thought, of science. In some cases, injecting them into people, scraping them into their skin, giving them all sorts of terrible diseases, but without telling them that he was doing any of this stuff. And it's just a really stomach-curdling experience reading about these experiments and realizing that he essentially got away with this whole thing. There were no repercussions in his life. And in fact, after this, he ended up joining the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, which I also talked about. So he really was involved in these two really horrible experiments, even though in some ways he thought he was doing good for the world.
I mean, and that's a really good question. I'm watching questions come through too. And with Walter Freeman, was there repercussions? He did lose his license, didn't he? But there wasn't like criminal like proceedings against him. Like, was he ever, you know,
he lost his surgical privileges, so he's not allowed to operate anymore in certain places. But no, there were no criminal or any kind of consequences against him. With surgery, really, it's still somewhat today. It's kind of loosey-goosey about regulations. Drugs, medical devices are very tightly regulated. Surgery is a little more open-ended, where if you can come up with a plan and get your ethical review board to sign off on it, I mean, you're not allowed to do whatever you want, but you have a lot of free reign in terms of surgery. Wow.
I mean, that is an unsettling thought for sure. Someone actually asked, who decided what patients were eligible for the lobotomy? Do you know how it was? Like, was this just sort of random? Like, this person's in the insane asylum, they're very, you know, unruly, they're difficult, like, let's get them lobotomy. There wasn't like an official process you had to go through necessarily to get diagnosed and get, you know, treated with
Walter
lobotomy.
Freeman was an extremely informal person, where he would just, if you showed up and you were willing to pay, he would do a lobotomy. Or he would go to the superintendent of an asylum and say, okay, what do we got today? Line them up, let me just do the lobotomy. And I think there's a picture in the book too that shows him. He often did these surgeries without a face mask. He didn't believe in what he called all that germ crap. He would do it with bare hands. He did not care about any of that kind of stuff. And just wham, bam, get in, get out, and no official proceeding, anything like that.
My God. And I wrote the book on germ theory. That is just mind boggling. Like, so many years after, then people are still.
Yeah, exactly. He didn't have the excuse of coming. No, he was in the middle. It was crazy.
I mean, that's what, again, like, to go back to that, guys, these people were doing things that I think like outsiders could say in their own time, like, that was dubious, that was, you know, unethical in its own time.
Right. That's actually one more thing I should mention. Kind of the big irony of both Freeman and especially John Cutler is that at this time, the 1940s, we had just won World War II, and they were in Germany trying and hanging some Nazi doctors, for violating ethical standards.
Wow.
So experimenting on concentration camp prisoners, essentially. Mm-hmm. That's where the famous Nuremberg Code of medical ethics was coming from. So at the same time, Cutler was working on these experiments, doing these awful experiments in Guatemala. They were trying these doctors in Germany for doing things that were no worse in some ways. So I really think if John Cutler had been a German and we had caught him in Germany, he would have gone on trial for war crimes. But because he was an American working in a country where there wasn't a lot of supervision, he essentially got away with the whole thing. Yeah,
and at the beginning of your book too, you hit some in the introduction, some hard topics there about, you know, when you're thinking about the Nazi medical experiments and the ones that you cited on hypothermia that have never been replicated because they were deeply unethical, and we can even say indeed evil. But it is the only scientific data we have on that subject. And how do you then use that data?
Yeah, or do you use that data?
Or do you use it?
That's an ongoing debate with some of these experiments. As I emphasize in the book, the vast majority of the work that was done unethically by the Nazis' concentration camps, it had no medical value. It deserves to be buried and forgotten about. There's nothing worthwhile about it. But there were a few cases, such as the hypothermia case, where, as you said, they did experiments on reviving people who have hypothermia. And for obvious ethical reasons, no one has ever redone those experiments today. So the question becomes, do we use that data or do we ignore that data? And there's been big arguments in the past about what we should do with this data. And in the book, I really just try to present both sides. The one side is it was obviously unethical. We shouldn't use it. We should just get rid of it and forget about it. The other side is, well, it happened. We can't undo it. And what if it could save lives today? And I don't pretend that I have a good answer for this. I think the book, in a lot of ways, was just trying to raise the issue about not only this, but other ethical cases as well, to get people talking about it, to get people thinking about it, because a lot of these stories still kind of have cast shadows onto work going on today. And so one thing I hope the book can do, in addition to these sort of true crime stories, is really get us thinking about and looking at the science going on today and making sure that we're monitoring it, making sure it's ethical so that we don't repeat the same mistakes that you can see being repeated in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. What question from Arian, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Was there anything that was too upsetting to go in the book? Was there like a case that you just thought it's too dark and I have to cut it?
Well, no cases that were too dark necessarily. I didn't go into eugenics. That was one topic, partly because it's been covered a lot elsewhere. So I thought it had kind of been done. And a lot of the Nazi experiments, there were actually some more sadistic ones that I didn't talk about in the book, simply because they did not have any medical value. It was just sadistic people doing awful things because they could get away with it. So I wanted to look at some of the trickier cases essentially and kind of leave the other stuff aside.
I mean, equally, were there cases that didn't make it in because it was just a little bit too, it wasn't like stabbing someone in the eye and removing their brain. It was a little bit too, I'm thinking of Edward Jenner, who created the smallpox vaccine in the 18th century. He experimented on a child with this vaccine. We would look at that today as unethical, but there was no ethical standards, and he wouldn't necessarily have viewed that as problematic. Were there some cases that you were like, oh, it's not black and white enough, and so you had to put him in the no pile?
Yeah, there were some marginal cases where, as you said, it was things that we would look back on it and maybe our ethical standards have changed or something like that, where we would look back on it and say it was a little dicey now. And, the reason they kind of got away with it, so to speak, was that it worked. So got away with it because the vaccine worked essentially. So there were cases like that where I just decided, it was probably a little ambiguous, but there are other sort of juicier stories to get into.
And there were juicier stories. That brings up one of my favorite stories, and I just want to hear you talk about it because it's just such a fun case. Tell us about how the Thanksgiving turkey helped solve a Victorian crime at Harvard. Because I feel like as a storyteller, you must have been like, this has everything. This has to go in the book because it's such a wild story, a Harvard professor killing someone. So tell us about that story.
Yeah, essentially it was a Harvard professor who murdered a Harvard trustee over some debts that one had to the other. But what really captured me about it was that the doctor who ended up committing the murder, he used his anatomical knowledge to commit the murder and then to get rid of the body, essentially. So he tried to get rid of it in a way that a layperson would not have, using his knowledge of anatomy in order to dispose of the body. But he didn't quite have enough time to get rid of it. And what really was sort of interesting about this case was that he committed the crime in a medical school. A case where, as we were talking about earlier, there were dead bodies coming in and out all the time. How did they know whose body it was? How did they know he'd been murdered there and not killed somewhere else and his grave dug up and brought in? All of these really interesting questions. And without spoiling too much, a janitor who was working on the case, the professor ended up giving him a Thanksgiving turkey as a gift. And that ended up being kind of a clue for him, where he thought, why is he giving me this turkey? Why is he sending me across town to get this turkey when he could have had it sent here to me? And so the janitor ends up being kind of the hero in this case, the one who broke it wide open. And then it's kind of interesting that the other doctors at Harvard Medical School used their anatomical knowledge to identify the body and to figure out how the murder had been committed. So
it was
early
fascinating.
forensics cases.
Yeah, the dental work on him, I think
Dental
what you
work,
said was
yep.
used. And I mean, it's just one of those stories that you tell so brilliantly. And it just really, it's funny because it's happened a long time ago. But the circumstances of it are just so outrageous. And you think this has to be fiction, the janitor breaking through the brick wall and all this kind of stuff. So you guys, the book is worth it alone for that story. It's definitely one of my favorite stories in there. So what's the wildest story? Not necessarily the darkest or the most sinister, but what's like the wildest story in your opinion that you uncovered through your research?
I think one that stands out to me it again relates back to body snatching. It was such a rich vein. It was what they called the Anatomy Riots. I was thinking about this the other day. Like in school, we learned about like the Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion, and I barely remember what those were. But I really wish we had learned about the Anatomy Riots, because that one definitely would have stuck in my mind. So essentially, again, it was about body snatching, in that this was a case in New York City where there was a doctor who was trying to work on dissecting a patient. And, it was a good thing that doctors were dissecting bodies, because they had to learn anatomy, had to learn how the body works, things like that. But this doctor was dissecting a body, and some little children, they'd never seen a dead body. They kind of were peeking in the window, kind of looking in, going, oh my God, a dead body. And so he was sick of little children peeking, and he decided he was going to get back at them. So he picked up the woman's arm and he waved it at them, and he said, yoo-hoo, yoo-hoo. And then he made a joke that said something like, this is your mother, I just dug her up. Unfortunately, one of the little children there had just lost his mother, sadly. He started crying, went home to his father and said, this man said this thing to me. He said it was Mom, what's happening? And the father got mad. He grabbed a shovel, went out, dug up his wife's grave, and found nothing inside there. Now, we actually don't know whether that body in the lab was that woman's body or not. But in some ways, it didn't matter, because someone had taken her body somewhere along the line. And this man was apparently very influential in his community. And he was angry. He got pissed off, and he started rounding people up, and they marched on the hospital. He got several hundred people who had had their relatives stolen, their children stolen out of graves. They marched on the hospital and they started to riot. They smashed the windows. They dragged out all their anatomical equipment and smashed it in the street. The doctors had to flee. One of them ended up hiding up inside a chimney. They took the bodies inside. They reburied it. They had a full-on riot. Then the next night, more people heard about this. They started to get angry. And the next day, they had 5,000 people marching around in the streets of New York, going from hospital to hospital, destroying them. My favorite part about the whole thing was that when they got to Columbia University, Alexander Hamilton himself had to stand on the steps of Columbia and beg them not to burn down Columbia University. And he barely succeeded until they turned around and went after a different hospital. So
I feel like that should have made it into the musical. That would have been a great scene.
Yeah. But it really brings up again, it's sort of this shadow that gets cast on today, because we look back at it and we think, wow, what a wild story. I can't imagine people rioting and smashing hospital windows, all this stuff. But at the baseline, they were talking about health disparities between the rich people and poor people. And that's something we're still dealing with today. The coronavirus pandemic exposed that once again, as if we needed reminding. So in the book, I kind of talk about the Anatomy Riot as this wild, crazy, fun story. But if you look a little bit deeper, there are lessons that we can draw out and kind of reflect on how it informs our society today as well.
Yeah, and can you just quickly explain to people why the bodies of the poor were so much easier to obtain by body snatchers? Why there was this disparity?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of reasons. One, the rich people could hire guards to watch over their bodies. So that was one reason. They could also buy these kind of odd contraptions. They called them mort safes. So they were essentially iron cages that you would put around a body, around a coffin, so that people could not break in and get the body out. And if you Google them or you go to cemeteries in places like Scotland or London, you can still see these marked safes around the coffins. It's kind of wild. And essentially, what it comes down to is that the poor could afford to put guards and safeguards in place to protect their loved ones' bodies, whereas the poor could not. They were often buried in mass graves or in large graveyards where they didn't have people watching over, or the body snatchers would go in, they would get the guards drunk, they would drug them, they would tie them up, they would do whatever it took to go after these bodies.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing story. I loved that Alexander Hamilton was dropped into this random story as well. Like his appearance was a real surprise into the Anatomy Riots. Someone asked to go back to Walter Freeman, because everybody's interested in him. What do you think his motivation was? Was it narcissism? Did he genuinely believe he was helping these people? Like, was it a little bit of both?
I think it was this odd combination. It was a bit of a messiah complex where he thought he'd been sort of destined or kind of brought into the world to rid the world of mental illness, because he worked in asylums for a while, saw the state of it there, saw how filthy they were, how crowded they were, how awful they were. And he decided, I am going to do something to help all these people. So it was a genuine desire to help them, but also he was pretty happy that he was the one appearing in the Saturday Evening Post. He was the famous doctor, probably the most famous doctor in the United States at the time. So it really was kind of this combination of his ambition, but his desire to help people.
Did Freeman perform this on any of his own relatives?
Any of his own relatives? I don't think so.
Interested to see if that like translated into like his own circle there. If he was,
his wife had some issues, but he never did a lobotomy on anyone that I know of. Not that, his son actually ended up becoming his son was also a doctor, ended up becoming a critic of him, and had a very famous quote where he said, a successful lobotomy is like talking about a successful lobotomy is like talking about a successful automobile accident. In that it was just such a crude tool, there was no way it could actually have succeeded in helping anyone. So even his own family eventually realized that he had done some very dicey things.
It's interesting that maybe that didn't translate to sort of the people in his closest circle. Abby asks, what sparked your interest in science, say, before the disappearing spoon?
I had actually plans to be a scientist myself. I went to school as a physics major, got through about 3 years of it, loved it in a lot of ways, but eventually decided that doing science wasn't quite the best fit for me. Being in labs, doing lab work was not my favorite thing, but I still loved science and wanted to be involved in it in some way. And I'd always loved stories. I loved telling stories. And so it took me a while to kind of put the two together, but I eventually realized that I could be involved in science and tell stories about science, but without having to be in the lab and actually doing science. And I like this job because I can jump around to different topics. I can talk about anatomy and atomic physics and chemistry and all sorts of different things. So I like the variety of it, and I just like being able to tell these stories.
Yeah, they're amazing. So Christina has a question for you, and I bet this has come up because, we can't really control when our books come out, and your books come out in the middle of a pandemic and people are going to start associating certain things. What would you say to someone who uses these examples of past harmful medical procedures and trains of thought to justify their distrust in the COVID vaccinations?
Yeah, that's something I did think about and worry about. What I would say is that people mistrusting vaccines, things like that, that's often people who they're distrusting sort of the regular run-of-the-mill science. These are really cases where you can definitely see people crossing lines, doing unethical things, and it's fairly clear, even to people at the time, that they are doing these unethical things. These aren't just sort of normal run-of-the-mill science where people don't like what science is saying and they're trying to undermine it. These are people who are definitely crossing ethical boundaries, sacrificing people's lives, hurting them, harming them, things like that. Whereas, with vaccines, the coronavirus vaccine, things like that, that simply wasn't the case. It was a whole different scientific regime.
Yeah. Nick says, I see many future podcasts coming from stories and tales that did not make it into the book. The lost chapters of the Icepick Surgeon, perhaps, coming into your podcast. But kind of going along the lines of more serious topics, because, guys, this book it's got a lot of stuff, a lot of entertaining stuff, the Anatomy Riots, the body snatchers, but a lot of deep, thought-provoking questions that rise in here. And you rightly point out that slavery and science both shape each other. So can you tell us a little bit about that relationship between slavery and science?
Yeah, that was a topic that surprised me, perhaps naively. I didn't really look into it a lot or think about it a lot, but the basic idea was, I kind of, as a character that the story kind of revolves around, it was this naturalist in the 1700s, a man named Henry Smeathman, who started off as an abolitionist. He was against slavery, wanted to stop slavery. He was a British person, and he was running around in abolitionist circles in Great Britain at the time. But he also wanted to be a naturalist. He wanted to go abroad, make discoveries, make a name for himself, stuff like that. And he eventually realized, to his discomfort, that the only way he had to get to a lot of these places, given the circumstances that he was fairly poor, the only way he had to get to some of these places was to hitch rides on slave ships, because they didn't just send ships out on scientific expeditions at the time. The only people going to places in a lot of places in Africa, South America, places that naturalists wanted to go were these slave ships. So they ended up compromising their morals to go to these places and start working in natural history. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized, talked to historians, things like that it wasn't just these individual scientists who had compromised their morals. It was sort of science in general, that at the time, there were many, many scientists who were wrapped up in the slave trade to their shame. And it didn't really get out. It didn't really filter out into the larger scientific world that they were wrapped up in it. But in a lot of cases, they were. And a lot of science would not have gotten done at the time had they not been essentially taking advantage of the infrastructure of slavery. And it's a really uncomfortable truth in that a lot of times we want to think about science as a force for good in the world, a progressive force that's helping people out. And I really think it is. I think that comes up over and over in my books, all the good that science has done. But I think it's important to acknowledge that in some cases it was tangled up with things that were pretty dark, like the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, and I think this is what is brilliant about this book, because as you say, it's starting a dialogue. It's getting people to think about science in complex ways. It's not demonizing science, but it's pointing out the very the very different ways that we've acquired knowledge, and some of it not in a good way at all. And we have to confront that dark past, so to speak. Yeah,
so, as I mentioned, one thing I try to do in my books is just show the human side of science. And in a lot of my books, that comes out in a lighthearted way. They're kind of fun. And I think there are moments of levity in this book as well. But I do think it's important that when you talk about the heroes of science, you have to acknowledge there are some villains too. And these are the villains in this book.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And striking that tone can be hard because, you are a storyteller, and some of these stories are fantastically entertaining. But I think that you balance that really well, like I said, with the thought-provoking stories and getting us to really think and dig deeper. So you have a little bit of everything. So on the lines of writing, Lauren asks, can you talk a little bit more about your process for writing books? How do you organize your thoughts? Do you have any routines? How do you balance your writing and your research? A good trade question for you.
Yeah. I don't know that there's a real system to it as much as I just read very widely, try to read whatever I can, no matter what the topic is. I love jumping around to different topics, even if it's something I wouldn't think I would necessarily be interested in. I just want to dive in and just figure out what's going on. So I really like reading widely. I kind of have a file on my computer where I just jot story ideas down. When it comes time for a new book, I go back and look at it, try to see if there's a common thread or if I can bring different things in. I would say the one thing that I do that really helps me out in the storytelling sense is that I go through very thoroughly, read all the notes, try to figure out what's going to be the beginning, what's going to be the end, how to get there. I'm thinking about that stuff very immersed in the notes. But when it comes time to do that first draft of the chapter, I put the notes aside and just start writing and pretend I'm telling a story. And I'll go back to the notes to fact check, to try to, work in little details I might have forgotten. But I just want to make sure I'm telling the story, that it's something fluid, going from a beginning that's interesting to some way that wraps it up, and just getting that story out there. So for me, that's been one really important step, has been at some point to put the notes aside, not worry about all that stuff, and just get the story out there.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I feel like when I read your books, it's almost like, I'm sitting down, you're sitting there, and you are literally telling us a story. I mean, it feels very immersive, and it's not bogged down in academic jargon or anything like that. It's very accessible. It's very easy to understand. It's very entertaining, as I said. So you obviously are a master at that. There's a lot of questions coming in, and this was also on my paper. I'm not missing this very important fact, and actually Sam deals with this at the very end in an appendix. People want to know sort of what are the current technologies that are ripe for abuse, and tell us a little bit about how you address that at the end of the book.
Yeah, there was an appendix that I put in. It was eventually going to be a kind of a chapter on its own, but the editor was like, well, it's not quite fitting in, but I couldn't resist putting it in. It's an appendix on the future of crime. So essentially, I look at what genetic engineering, how we could use that to harm people, how we could use advanced computing technology, advanced or artificial intelligence, other things like that. And I look at crimes in space and how, certain deeds, certain acts, that we could even have new types of crime in space, that do things that don't really apply to life on Earth, just given how different life is in space. So those are three areas: space, genetic engineering, and advanced computing technology, that I talk about how we could essentially do each other wrong in the future based on these advanced technologies. So it's in the appendix.
How can we protect ourselves? Like, what's the answer? How do we go forward and set up a structure where we, and hopefully in modern times, we are doing this better. We have more protocols, more ethical standards in place. It's not like the 19th century, guys, in some cases, but, is there more that we can do? Is there more?
I think the one thing that's most important is just to make sure that we have these ethical issues in mind when we are designing experiments, and not just experiments, when we're designing technologies, computing technologies, things like that. I do think you're right that people nowadays are much more aware of those types of issues and keeping them in mind and making sure that we are cautious about moving forward. You see it nowadays with CRISPR, genetic engineering technology, where the leading scientists who won a Nobel Prize for this work, are talking about the ethical issues. And especially after researching this book, that's kind of a hard thing to imagine the people in the past being all that worried about the ethical issues. But I think it's much more in the forefront of people's minds nowadays.
Yeah, someone actually mentioned the CRISPR. Stephen asked, I believe, I'm trying to find, Stephen asked, do you physically type or do you dictate? Now, and I kind of want to know that now too.
Dictate, I never even thought about dictating.
No, I never either did either.
No, I type them out, yeah.
Yeah, you're physically putting it down. Did someone asked, did any patients of Freeman's die on the table while he was operating?
Yes, sadly, several did. He had a bad habit of nicking blood vessels in the brain, and several people bled out and died, yes.
And that did not stop him?
Nope, he would just go on to the next patient.
No, it's just mind-boggling. I think people, they can't get their head around that. Carolyn Bauer said, can you name any bad science going on today? But is there anything that you're actually, you're talking about things that are ripe for exploitation, but do you know of anything right now that you'd actually point to and say that might be?
Well, there was that scientist in China who used CRISPR to edit the germ lines of mother and father, an embryo, and two, I believe they were both young girls, were born who had been genetically engineered through CRISPR, essentially. And again, his goal was in some ways worthy. The father was HIV positive, and he wanted to make the girls immune to HIV because there are certain mutations out there where people are essentially immune to HIV. However, he kind of bungled the science, didn't do a very good job with it, and really didn't consult the wider community. I really think he thought that once he did this and got it out there, that he would be hailed as a hero. Unfortunately, he was not, and he's now in jail, actually. I believe he's in jail for doing this work. So yeah, you do see these cases pop up where
modern cases,
things like that. Yeah.
There might be a sequel to the Icepick Surgeon.
I hope not, but there might be. Yeah.
So Nick asked, do you ever get feedback from medical professionals today about these stories? Do they even know about these tales? Like who's your audience? Are there a lot of medical professionals coming to your talks, reading these books, learning about the dark days of their own science?
This one, I mean, the book's pretty new. It just came out a few days ago, so I haven't gotten a ton of feedback about it yet. I can say in general that I have kind of two audiences. One is a general audience who likes science, just wants a fun, lively introduction to different topics, so they enjoy it. But I do have a lot of scientists who read the books too. And what they really enjoy about it is they enjoy learning about the people involved. Because when you are a scientist and when you're just there's so much information to learn about your field, you often don't have time to learn about the history of it. So you use this procedure that's named after so-and-so, but you have no idea who this so-and-so is. So they hear about the person behind this. They learn that maybe they had led an amazing life. Maybe they were a complete jerk. Maybe there was something else incredible about them. So they really enjoy getting that backstory and actually putting a human face on something that they've dealt with every day of their lives, year after year, and now they finally know the story behind it.
Is it harder to write about the newer crimes, so to speak, in terms of the research available? I'm thinking with my next book, I go into the 20th century, and it was hard to access files because of patient confidentiality and et cetera, et cetera. Was that difficult, like as you got closer to sort of modern day, to kind of access the information you needed to piece that story together?
It was in some ways, yeah. There was a story that took place. The final chapter of the book is about a chemist, a fraudulent chemist, working up through the 2010. So this was a very recent case. And there was just a lot of scattered information. And so that one was a bit hard to kind of get it all together and gather it. So yeah, in some ways, the closer you get to modern times, the harder it is, because as you said, people are alive nowadays who are affected by it, things like that. Yeah. And as opposed to the older stories where people have safely passed and you don't have to worry as much about those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's harder to get a bigger sense in the past because sometimes you can't access there's not enough records left to kind of piece those stories together.
Yeah,
but then as you move into exactly.
Sometimes it's hard to know exactly what to think of something because we don't have the perspective that we might have.
And as you start to write about modern times, you have the possibility of people coming to your events that were affected by some of these stories even, I mean, some of Walter Freeman's patients must still be alive, I would guess.
Yeah, definitely.
And a lot of them went on to be disabled after these procedures. And so they were deeply affected by these procedures and didn't give their consent for that. So very interesting.
I do get emails from people who knew people that I've written about in books and things like that, and add stories and layers to the things I was talking about. So yeah, in some cases, people are alive today who've been affected by this or knew someone who was affected by this. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
So Rami asks, when you are immersed in researching and writing these dark tales, does it affect your personal ability to access joy and lightheartedness? It's a good question.
Ooh, there were definitely times when you were reading something and just reading about these awful things where it affects you, and it can't help but affect you to see this suffering, to see the bad things that happen to these people. So yeah, it's inevitable that you're going to be affected by it in some way. I think the trick is to just not get sucked down that hole and, or not too far at least, and just remember why you are writing the book.
Yeah.
And remember that I was doing it for kind of a larger purpose, which was to keep these stories out there, to honor the victims in some cases, or in other cases to kind of point out the flaws or the common things, the common themes we can see happening over and over and over, the common mistakes from chapter to chapter, that hopefully if we can recognize these patterns, we can stop them in science.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this isn't a voyeuristic look into the past. There's a real important theme that looms large in this book. And I think that, you have to keep that in mind when you're telling these stories, because this is about starting that dialogue. It's about getting people to think differently about stories that they thought that they knew. To go on a lighter note, your book is really about people who become obsessed or hyper-focused to the detriment of their work. So my question to you is, what are your obsessions? Do you have any obsessions?
Ooh, I should have been ready for this one. Boy, what are my obsessions? I mean, reading is a big one, but that's probably kind of an obvious one. I've always been a big runner, kind of a gym rat, things like that. Always been a big theater fan, so I enjoy doing that. So
you got a few little obsessions there, but nothing that is harming your writing at this stage. Nothing that's getting in the way of you producing books or anything like that.
No, not yet.
Not yet. So I think I'm just looking. It's hard, guys. I'm bouncing back and forth. You're leaving lots of great comments here, and I can't say enough good things about this book. You really got to get a copy. And I know some of you guys. I saw Australia, England. Sam, your book's out everywhere, right? Or it's coming in different countries.
It should be, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll keep you posted on all of that as well. But you can definitely get a signed book plate from Politics and Prose, which is an independent bookstore. So definitely support them. Everybody's suffering a bit during the pandemic, especially independent bookstores. So if you can buy it from them, that is great. And I see that it is almost midnight in England right now, and JD is going to come on. Sam, this has been such a riveting conversation. I could talk for another hour. I know you probably are exhausted and have other events to go to, but thank you so much. And it's just been so fascinating. So I'm going to hand it over to JD.
All right. Thank you again, Sam. Thank you again, Lindsay. And thank you to all of our viewers. We enjoyed the talk immensely. I know I personally did. I've been a big fan of both of you, so this has been a treat. If you enjoyed the event, if this piqued your interest at all, please follow the link in the chat to purchase the book. Again, it is the Icepick Surgeon. You can purchase it at Politics and Prose, help support Sam. You can also find Sam's other books and Lindsay's books as well in Politics and Prose. Support them, support us, help this whole community sort of continue on. Your patrons will just keep these events going, and we really appreciate it.
I will add, if we didn't get to all the questions, I'm sorry about that. If you do have a burning question and you want to ask, you can go to my website, samkean.com. Contact me, send an email. I love hearing from people. Happy to answer your questions. So no problem at all.
Amazing.
You're going to get flooded with questions.
Right? That sounds great.
I might ask them myself.
Yeah, JD is going to be there.
Thank you again, everyone. We'll be signing off. This has been PNP Live. Have a wonderful night.